people think that goes away in April with the heat.
Hello, welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Shaz Lachidello.
This week, President Trump finally builds that wall in Washington, D.C.
And some Democrats are calling for the defunding of police or disbanding them altogether.
In the History Department, did JFK steal the presidency?
And I'll look into crime and punishment of African Americans. But first,
a funeral service was held in Houston, Texas earlier today for George Floyd, the 46-year-old father, truck driver and security guard whose death while having his neck crushed by a Minneapolis police officer last month triggered outrage and more than 2 weeks of protests against police brutality around the world.
Those 4 officers were literally on him for 9 minutes, and none of them showed they have a heart or soul. This is not just murder, but a hate crime.
Meanwhile, barricades were erected around the White House this week following last week's peaceful Black Lives Matter protest over the road in Lafayette Square. The fence has become a spontaneous memorial with protesters attaching signs and placards condemning police. It was set up to stop a repeat of the demonstrations in front of the White House, which were dispersed with rubber bullets and chemical agents, including what are called pepper balls. Attorney General Bill Barr, who ordered the troops in, denied tear gas was used, though.
The tear gas was used Sunday when they had to clear 8th Street to allow the fire department to come in to save St. John's Church. That's when tear gas was used.
There were chemical irritants, the part.
No, there were not chemical irritants. Pepper spray is not a chemical irritant. It's not chemical.
Pepper spray, you're saying, is what was used.
Pepper balls.
Oh, that was all news to the maker of pepper balls, who boast on their website it's the most effective chemical irritant available. It is a chemical agent, even if it's partially derived from some natural compounds. There's also been a pretty dumb semantic argument about whether pepper balls containing pepper spray are technically tear gas. Experts do point out tear gas, like pepper agents, are powders, not gas anyway. And according to factcheck.org, the Centres for Disease Control say pepper spray is a type of tear gas. Oh, and they reportedly found CS artificial tear gas canisters in Lafayette Park anyway. Still, President Trump's call last week to deploy the US military against rioters has been condemned by his former Defence Secretary Jim Mattis, who, in a remarkable attack, accused Trump of trying to divide the country and of lacking mature leadership. Well, that led to a Twitter attack from the president and a defence of Mattis from Trump's former Chief of Staff, General John Kelly. It was, all in all, a pretty rare sign of dissent from former administration officials, Chaz.
Yeah, look, it's fair to say Trump's plan hasn't worked out quite as he would have hoped. According to NPR, 67% of people say Trump's response has mostly increased tensions, and only 18% say it's mostly decreased tensions. And 73% of independents said that Trump has mostly increased tensions in the last week or so. But even worse, Morning Consult polled people in the days before the Lafayette Park incident and in the days after. And people went from 55 to 30 in favour of military intervention to 42 to 48 against. Even Democrats were 48 to 42 in favour of military intervention before the Lafayette Park incident. Now, not so much. And finally, independents went from 46 to 30 in favour of military intervention to 37 to 49 against. Here's more proof that Trump backed the wrong horse there. 59% of people are more concerned about the police's actions, whereas only 27% of people are more concerned about the protesters' actions. Probably hasn't helped that out of the 67 times that journalists were physically assaulted last week, 42 of those times were at the hands of police. And finally, you can tell that Trump feels like he's stuck in a hole because he sent out 200 tweets and retweets on just one day, Friday. A new all-time record for Trump. That is some serious panic going on there.
Certainly serious tweeting, Chaz. Congressional Democrats, meanwhile, have introduced a Justice in Policing Act, making it easier to prosecute police for misconduct, creating an independent process to investigate excessive use of force. It would also ban chokeholds, including the kind that was used to kill George Floyd, and end no-knock warrants, as well as racial profiling. The bill faces an uncertain future in the Republican-controlled Senate, though. Earlier, led by Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Democrats took a knee in remembrance of George Floyd.
We are here to honor George Floyd. For those who wish to, we will now kneel for our moment of silence.
And it wasn't just Democrats. 2012 Republican presidential nominee Mitt Romney was also showing his support for the protests this week, which continued to grow in size. He became the first Republican politician known to join in such a march.
We need a voice against racism. We need many voices against racism and against brutality. We need to stand up and say that Black Lives Matter.
But as the protests simmer down to Romney levels of affability, the calls for reform are getting louder. Back in 2015, when Michael Brown died, only 43% of people thought his death was a symptom of a broader problem. But today, 74% think that George Floyd's death is a symptom of a broader problem. And one potential area of reform is making the police a little more accountable. You may recall this incident last week. And that video came out just after the Buffalo police had claimed that fellow was injured because he tripped and fell. Oh dear. Well, those two officers were charged with assault, but then amazingly, even after that, the president of the police union maintained he didn't know how much contact the police had made, and he thought the old guy did actually slip. Well, let's look at that trip from another angle, shall we? Very clumsy indeed. People became even more irritated with the police when they heard that all 57 officers resigned from the Emergency Response Task Force in a show of support for the two charged officers. Except that's not actually true. It turns out at least some of the police resigned from the task force because the police union said they weren't legally backing the officers anymore. There's your proof right there. A letter saying that for financial reasons, the union would not be financially supporting their legal defences during the protests. So that's why the police refused to serve during the protests, but the unions pretended it was a show of support for the violent cops. If you want reform, those police unions might be a good place to start.
It might indeed, Chaz. Back in Minneapolis, meanwhile, the city's council this week voted to dismantle the local police force and use the money to instead pay for more mental health services, housing and education. There have been similar calls to defund police departments across the United States this week and to fundamentally change the role of police in the community.
Black lives, they matter here.
New York Mayor Bill de Blasio says he will redirect police funds to social services. President Trump, though, is not a fan.
There won't be defunding, there won't be dismantling of our police, and there's not going to be any disbanding of our police. Our police have been letting us live in peace.
Joe Biden isn't crazy about the idea either. He's mapped out a police reform plan but does not advocate defunding.
I don't blame him for being a bit careful, John. Cutting police budgets polls at about 15% amongst all Americans, even amongst Democrats.
Well, Chaz, joining us is Eric Adams. These days, he is the borough president of Brooklyn. He's a former member of the New York Police Department, and growing up in that area in the 1970s, he was also the target himself of police violence. Mr. Adams, welcome to Planet America.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I've been hearing quite a bit in recent days about this push to dismantle or defund various police forces. What do you think of that?
Well, first, I think it's important for us all to agree on the same language, and I believe what happened in Minnesota sends sort of a mixed message. They are not looking, of my understanding, to disband the police department. They're having conversations, as we are doing here in New York, how to utilize the police department's budget to do more proactive things instead of just responding to crime.
The idea that a police force can be fundamentally reformed, do you think you can have that kind of root and branch change?
I definitely believe it could actually be reformed in a very real and positive way. This is my life work. As many people know, here in America, I was beaten badly by police officers, my brother and I was encouraged by those civil rights leaders in Brooklyn to go into law enforcement. And reluctantly, I went into the occupation and started an organization that allowed me to push for reform inside the agency. And I saw many changes throughout the years, and now it's time to go even further. And I think the energy in America is now calling for mandatory changes in how we police.
What would you say would be the most important and achievable reforms to police now?
Look at the officers that we have in our police departments across America. For far too long, we have become a safe haven for abusive police officers. They come with different issues and psychological issues. Remember, when we recruit police officers, we recruit them from society. And in society, we have a cross-sections of different personalities, and not everyone is fit to deal with the pressures that are involved in being a police officer. But for far too long, we have held on to them without taking immediate action. We saw a different form of action in Minnesota, where the officer was fired right away and the 3 officers involved and an immediate indictment. That is a huge, big step in policing.
And Mr. Adams, how have you felt in the last couple of weeks or so, having been yourself on both sides, the victim of police violence, as well as having been in law enforcement yourself?
Well, this is my life work and commitment for over 40 years. When I looked at the face of the officer who murdered George Floyd, watching him with this sense of satisfaction, I thought about the officer that kicked my brother and I in our groin over and over again, and looking at their faces and the level of just total disdain that they had in comfort. And so when you see these marches, you understand that finally the cries of Black and brown men throughout the history of America of not saying only I can't breathe, but please stop. The number of abuses that we've went through throughout our lives. And I also know the importance of public safety. When I was a police officer, I marched with protesters over several shootings and killings, but I've also protected those who were marching. And I know what it is to be spit at and called names and say that I was a sellout. And so I understand the complexity of this conversation, and we're going to need patience, and we're going to need commitment and dedication to live in a coexistent and a peaceful way to get us through this.
Eric Adams, many thanks indeed for your time.
Thank you. Take care.
This week, something a little unexpected happened. There were signs the US economy was springing back to life after an unprecedented 3-month tailspin triggered by the coronavirus shutdown and the massive disruption to trade, travel and everyday life. First, it was confirmed the US economy had plummeted into recession in February, yet the stock market is up. The S&P is now back to where it was before the pandemic.
Is this the fabled V-shaped recovery that so many people were hoping for?
Good question, Jim Cramer. Well, unemployment, which had been expected to surge into the 20-something% range in May, actually fell in the month to 13.3%.
Really big jobs report. Great going, President Trump. Kidding, but true.
Well, those improving employment figures reflect the reopening of America. It's been 2 to 3 weeks now, so if they were reopening too fast, you might start seeing some COVID effects by this point. And at least with the daily deaths, that is so far not the case. The 7-day average shows a slow reduction in deaths, but a reduction nevertheless. And at the state level, deaths are generally improving. Daily new cases, alas, are stuck on the same plateau nationally that they've been on for almost a month now. But there is some worse news lurking under the surface there. Florida is now experiencing a spike in cases. California's daily new cases never went down and they're still rising. North Carolina's daily new cases are still rising as well, but even more rapidly than California's. And Arizona is having one hell of a case spike. And that is all before we see the potentially super spreading effects of these protests. Ask Dr. Fauci.
It's a perfect setup for further spread of the virus in the sense of creating these blips which might turn into some surges. I mean, obviously, not only are they congregating physically close to each other, but often when they start screaming and demonstrating.
That is what they do. We'll start seeing by the end of next week whether he's got cause to be worried, John.
Yes, and if he's worried, we're worried.
In the Fox News justice system, the people are presented with 2 separate yet equal opinions. When it's good to commit a crime, and that it's never good to commit a crime. One is a Dallas hair salon owner who opened her store in violation of a court order to prevent coronavirus. The other, largely peaceful nationwide protest against police brutality. These are their stories.
The woman in Dallas, as Greg said, I'll always remember where I was when I saw that woman really stick up for her principles and to see her relief and I admire it. I really do. It is hard to imagine that they seem to be more concerned about the lawless and then for the people who actually obey the law.
I mean, these are individuals who are trying to save their lives. She's fighting for her life, but for that, they're putting her in jail. Violating curfews and taunting National Guardsmen should be celebrated, apparently, in some media outlets. These news anchors, that's what you want to call them, they're taking sides with anarchists.
Is there a law in Texas that says you have to grovel before morons who are wearing robes? Insisting that everyone in the country follows the same rules is not racism. In fact, it's the answer to racism. It is the one thing we must defend, and if we don't, it's over. Good luck to your client. More than good luck. We're rooting for her. This is an awful thing that's happened, and I hope it awakens people to what's happening in a lot of places.
America's 35th president, John F. Kennedy, is indeed remembered for his speeches, his youth and glamour, his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis when the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war, and of course, he's remembered for his tragic assassination. But should he also be remembered as the guy who stole the presidency?
Let the word go forth from this time.
When Jack Kennedy took the oath of office in January 1961, he proclaimed the beginning of a new era.
The torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace.
Kennedy had pioneered a new kind of presidential campaign, going straight to primary voters rather than party bosses, and in the general election, outshining his rival, Vice President Richard Nixon, on the still new medium of television.
The people now have the opportunity to evaluate his as against mine, and I think both he and I are going to abide by whatever the people decide.
Senator Kennedy?
Well, I'll just say that the question is of experience, and the question also is what our judgment is of the future, and what our goals are for the United States, and what ability we have to implement those goals.
But did the people really decide the election of 1960, or, as some have argued, was it rigged in favour of Kennedy? JFK won the national popular vote by a pretty thin margin, fewer than 120,000 votes from around 68 million cast. His Electoral College win looked wider, 303 to 219, but the two states that swung the election to Kennedy, Illinois with 27 Electoral College votes and Texas with 24, were won by just 9,000 and 46,000 votes respectively. If Nixon had won Illinois and Texas in 1960, he would have taken the White House. And the idea that Kennedy stole the election persists, like in this exchange between MSNBC's Andrea Mitchell and former Bush advisor Bill Kristol.
Richard Nixon not challenging, that
Kennedy
had stolen the election in 1960, which, obviously had been stolen in 1960.
Now, how it might have happened in a moment, but first, a little bit of myth-busting. This idea that Richard Nixon didn't challenge the result for the good of the nation is not quite right. In true Tricky Dick fashion, he kind of had it both ways. He did formally concede to Kennedy the day after the election, but Nixon's lawyers and Republican Party allies immediately launched bids for recounts, not just in Illinois and Texas, but also Delaware, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, New Jersey, New Mexico, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina. Nixon publicly distanced himself from the legal action while privately encouraging it. He said he realised
charges of sore loser would follow me through history and remove any possibility of further political career. Richard M. Nixon.
The recounts came up with no significant discrepancies, a few dozen votes under or over here and there. The only state to be flipped after a court case was Hawaii, which was actually given to Kennedy instead of Nixon. And so, as sitting vice president, it fell to Nixon to announce the election result to Congress, perhaps through gritted teeth.
John F. Kennedy of the state of Massachusetts has received for President of the United States 303 votes. Richard M. Nixon of the state of California has received 219 votes.
Publicly, Nixon remained gracious.
I do not think that we could have a more striking and eloquent example of the stability of our constitutional system.
But suspicion persisted about the result in Chicago's Cook County, where Kennedy won by a surprisingly large margin of 318,000 votes. And that suspicion may have been well-founded. Chicago's Democratic Mayor Richard Daley was an old-school party boss. His political machine was very efficient at getting out the vote legally by calling in favours, promising free lunches and hams, rounding up union voters in buses. But his rivals claimed he wasn't against having those people vote under multiple names, including dead people who are still on the electoral roll. Mayor Daley also had a reputation for making votes for the other candidate disappear. Investigators, including the FBI, who were bugging Daley's associates, believed tens of thousands of votes may have just vanished. But they weren't all for Nixon. They were mostly for the Republican state attorney, Ben Adamowski. Some historians think if Daley was stuffing ballots in Cook County at all, it was to beat Adamowski, not Nixon. Kennedy may have benefited, although they point out Republicans were doing plenty of ballot stuffing of their own in southern Illinois. In those days, both sides did it. Maybe one just did it a bit better. Robert Dallek, the great chronicler of that period, says JFK
probably stole Illinois from Nixon,
but also points out Kennedy
would have won even without Illinois. Robert Dallek.
That just leaves Texas, where Kennedy may have profited from his running mate Lyndon Johnson's political connections. LBJ had been on both sides of some pretty dodgy elections in his years in Congress, but Dallek says the margin there was too big to rig.
46,000 fraudulent votes would have been more than the most skilled manipulator of returns could have hidden. Robert Dallek.
Although LBJ was pretty skilled. As for Richard Nixon, he continued to believe he'd been robbed, reportedly telling guests at a Christmas party in 1960,
"We won, but they stole it from us." Richard M. Nixon.
The election of 1960 helped to fuel Nixon's paranoia about the Kennedys, and 12 years later, as Nixon ran for a second term, motivated the dirty tricks of Watergate that seeded his ultimate disgrace and demise. It also shows allegations of voter fraud are easy to make, hard to prove, but can still cast a shadow over a result.
There's been a lot of talk in the last 2 weeks about police shootings of black people. You may have seen stats like these. Even though the population is only about 12% black, about 26% of people shot and killed by police are black, and 36% of unarmed people who are shot and killed by police are black. So that's racist, right? Well, not necessarily, because maybe police are around black people a whole lot more than they are around white people. That's why you get studies that find black men are 2.5 times more likely than white men to be killed by police, yet the study still doesn't draw conclusions about racial bias, because they say not every person has an equal chance of coming into contact with police, and crime rates and policing practices differ across different populations. Also, with unarmed people getting shot by police, we're talking very small sample sizes, and thankfully getting smaller. But some studies try to crunch the numbers anyway. This is what they find. When contextual factors are taken into account, the racial differences in shooting numbers disappear. But on non-lethal uses of force, blacks and Hispanics are more than 50% more likely to experience some sort of force. And contextual factors may reduce, but they do not fully explain these racial disparities. And you find that all over the criminal justice system. It's not so much the big things, it's the little things that are demonstrably racially biased. And they all add up to create extremely biased outcomes. Let me show you.
Big, beautiful world.
Now, shootings are a big deal. Even racist police usually need a good reason to shoot someone, but pulling a car over, on the other hand, not so much. So it's interesting that a study of 20 million car stops found black drivers have 4 times the odds of white drivers of being stopped and searched, even though they were less likely to be found with contraband after being searched, according to the study. You see, it's those kinds of decisions where the police have most discretion, and that's where their bias really shows. Like, for instance, how the black arrest rates for prostitution are 5 times higher than the white arrest rates, or the black arrest rates for gambling are 10 times higher than white arrest rates. That's discretion. Or the biggest discretionary charge, drug possession. Black and white people use illegal drugs at about the same rate, yet black people are about 5 times as likely to go to prison for drug possession as white people are. Hey, let's take it further. For any misdemeanor charge which carries a potential prison sentence, white people are 75% more likely to have those charges dropped, dismissed, or amended than black people are. You see, racial bias doesn't just look like the barrel of a gun, sometimes it looks like the fine print of a law journal. What about more serious crimes though? Well, another point of discretion is in setting bail. And the average bail for black men charged with violent crimes is set about $7,000 higher than the average bail for white people charged with violent crimes. Bail is set $10,000 higher for black men charged with public order crimes and $13,000 higher for black men charged with, of course, drug crimes, and that is all controlled for a bunch of stuff like the seriousness of the crime and their criminal histories, etc. But don't think the judges stop there. Oh no, they also sentence black men to federal prison sentences that are 19% longer than white men receive for the same crimes. And that's once again after controlling for like everything. But guess what? That gap has grown over the last 20 years or so. In fact, when it comes to drug crimes, again, and property crimes, black people are serving 1% more time a year, while time served by white people is dropping. By now, you'll be unsurprised to hear that nearly half of life and effectively life sentence prisoners are black. Although maybe black people just commit more of the worst crimes. That could be the case. Or maybe they get screwed over more. Black people make up a majority of innocent people wrongfully convicted of crimes and later exonerated. Black sexual assault convictions are 3.5 times more likely to be found wrongful than white convictions. Black drug crime convictions, of course, are 12 times more likely to be found wrongful, and black murder convictions are 7 times more likely to be found wrongful. And out of those, black wrongful convictions are 22% more likely to involve police misconduct than white wrongful convictions. So, where does that all leave us? It leaves us with over 2% of adult black males in prison at any one time. We're talking about 465,000 black prisoners, or about 1/3 of the people in prison. And if you compare that to the general population, where there's only 12% of black people, so the black rate of incarceration is about 2.5 times their share in the population. And black 18 and 19-year-olds are about 12 times more likely to be imprisoned than their white equivalents. By the age of 23, 49% of black males have been arrested, compared to 38% of white males, which actually, stop. Now, I know what you're thinking. I've also found it hard to believe that half of young black men and 38% of young white men have been arrested. But arrested doesn't mean charged or convicted. And also, I found like 3 studies that were all in the same ballpark. So hey, America arrests a lot of people. All right, back on. This is a problem, because the odds of a black man making it to the middle class are about 60% lower for those who are charged with a crime as a young adult. This affects the whole community. 63% of black people have had an immediate family member incarcerated, compared to 42% of white people. And black women between the ages of 25 and 54 outnumber black men of the same age in the general community by a staggering 1.5 million. So for every 100 prime-aged black women living outside jail, there are 83 black men. That's not only because of jail, by the way. Black men also die early. But anyway, I've left the worst till last. You might think this is just a poverty thing. Well, not entirely, because this is the curve of incarceration rates for young white men versus how much their parents earned when they were growing up. And this is the same curve for young black men. So, the top 1% of young black men who grew up in millionaire families had the same incarceration rate as young white men who grew up in families earning $36,000 a year. So it's not just a poverty thing. Although, look at those incarceration rates for poor young black men. Yikes. Now, don't get me wrong. Things are getting better. From 2000 to 2016, the rate of black male imprisonment has fallen from 9 times the white men's rate to just under 6 times the white men's rate. And black women have progressed even further, from about 6 times the white women's rate to about twice the white women's rate. But like I always say, there is a long, long way to go.
Big, beautiful world. No rush. That's it for another trip to Planet America. We'll see you on Friday night on the ABC News channel for a fireside chat.
I've got a fresh episode of the podcast out right now. Get it there. And you can find our TV shows on iView, Facebook and YouTube. See ya.
Good night.